So for the last 4 weeks, I've been working on building the most realistic water simulation I possibly could that runs in the web browser. And today I'm excited to finally share with you what I've come up with. Now I'm calling the system Three.js Water Pro because it is built on top of Three.js, which is the popular 3D rendering library for the web. What I've built here is not just a water simulation, it's a complete system that encapsulates everything you need to create really nice looking water. With water alone, you don't get a whole lot. You need a really nice sky. You need to also model the underwater dynamics with the ocean floor and all of that lighting. I've implemented all of that, and in this video, I'm going to run through all the different features and capabilities. Starting off with, we're looking at the demo app I built here. So this allows you to try out different presets, different quality levels, and basically tune every parameter that's offered in real time. So you can see we have our little boat and buoy floating on the water here. We have an island in the distance with the waves breaking on the shore. And we have our beautiful sky simulated with our sun, the clouds. All of that is being simulated in real time. It's all tunable. This isn't textures and cube maps and things like that. Now I can also go under the water surface here, and you can see the reflection of the boat coming through. You can see the light patterns on the ocean floor. So I've modeled all of this, and this is all completely controllable to kind of tune it however you'd want it to for your game. So let's start by jumping through some of the different presets. I've created 10 different presets here. This one is the choppy preset. So you get kind of some choppy waves. Let's take a look at the Arctic preset. So this is a bit grayer. I've configured the foam to look like ice chunks floating on the water. Let's take a look at the foggy preset. So this is a lot calmer, and you can see the fog is much closer to the boat, giving that more kind of eerie feeling. Let's save hurricane for last. That's a fun one. Let's take a look at tranquil. So I've cranked up the reflection a bit more on this one, just because the water surface is, obviously very tranquil and undisturbed, so you're picking up a lot more of that sky. There's also a tropical setting here. So I've set the water to be a bit more transparent so you can see through to the ocean floor. And we have that brilliant sun in the sky. You get these nice sparkles off the surface. Let's see here. Let's check out storm. So this one, I've cranked up the wave heights a bit. You can control all this via a wind speed parameter. So you can change that on the fly. If you're trying to simulate some type of seafaring game and all of a sudden a storm rolls in, you can programmatically increase that wind speed, and all of a sudden the waves will start picking up. Let's look at the hurricane next. So with this one, obviously the swells are much larger here, and they're almost too large with the ocean floor coming through there. So let me drop that down a bit. So yeah, this is about as intense as this can possibly get. I think I have it cranked up too high. Let me turn the amplitude down. So this demonstrates some very low frequency swells that are kind of going through, almost like a tsunami type thing going on. But obviously cranked up a little too high, or starting to have some of the ground show through. Now, there's one last preset I want to look at, and that is the Sea of Thieves preset. So this one's probably my favorite. So in Sea of Thieves, if you played that game, the water is absolutely gorgeous in that. One day I hope this looks as good as that. But in that, you see a lot of that subsurface scattering. So the light coming through the wave crests, and you get that kind of glowing turquoise look to the water. And this looks really beautiful. So I try to capture that in this preset. So those are the different presets. Obviously, you can come in here and customize it to whatever you want. But since we're running on the web here, we need to account for different devices that we might be running on. So the Three.js Water Pro comes packaged with 4 different quality presets. So I have a ultra preset, which we're looking at now. So that's a very fine detail. That's simulating all the optics and everything. And then we also have a high preset. So that's reducing the level of detail by a little bit, but it still has all the features turned on. Now looking at the medium preset, this is when we start to see some of that wave detail go away. So there's 3 different levels of detail that are being added together in the wave simulation, which is all based on real oceanographic data, by the way. So in the medium quality, we're losing that finest level of detail. And then if we go to low, we're only getting the very lowest level of detail, but obviously this will run quite well on even pretty low-powered devices. So that's kind of the high-level parameters you can tune, the presets and the quality. So let's start diving into some of the more fine-grained features. So let me pick a different preset here. I'm going to go back to choppy. We'll go back to ultra quality. So let's just kind of go down the list here. We'll start with buoyancy. So obviously I can toggle these objects on or off. But we can go in here and we can enable these sample points. So when you add an object to the water, there's a special method for that. It'll look at the object's bounding box and determine where to place these sample points. So it's looking at the height of the ocean surface at all times, each frame, when it's updating the height and the pitch and the rotation of the object as that water surface is moving around. So you can go in here, you can opt for a single point sample mode. So the object will just go up and down with no rotation. So it might be nice for smaller objects. You can control the height offset. So you can get that way down in the water. Let's put it right back kind of in the middle. You can control how responsive the tilting is. So I can say none at all or crank that up quite a bit. And you can also change the smoothing of the height and the tilt changes. So for a really heavy object, it's going to have a lot of inertia. It's not going to want to move very fast. So I can crank up that smoothing parameter and it'll start to move kind of more slowly. Whereas for something like a buoy, that kind of has the center of gravity way down low, so it's going to be moving around quite a bit. So you want to turn that smoothing to off almost completely. All right, so moving on to the foam. There's a couple different types of foam that I've simulated here. So we have foam for the wave crests. We also have some surface foam, which I call procedural foam. And that's just using some smart noise on top. And then we have the contact foam or the shoreline foam. So let's run through each of these. So for the wave crests, it's easiest to see if I just turn these off. And you can change the color of that. You can change the opacity. So all different knobs for tuning basically every facet of this. You can make it look a bit harder, or you can increase the softness. Give it kind of more of like a filamented, smooth look. And you can also control at what sort of slope of the wave you'll start to see that foam. Now, if you crank this up too high, you'll start to see some of the repetition in the water. Obviously, we're not simulating the whole entire surface here. That would just be way too computationally intensive. So we're kind of simulating that very far horizon wave simulation by stacking these different simulations together at different resolutions. So I try and turn this down just to where the wave crests are visible, and I think that gives kind of the best effect. Now let's take a look at the procedural foam. So this isn't really visible on here. Let's go look at the Arctic preset. So I can change the scale of this foam. I can change the offset. So this is simulated using Voronoi noise, which kind of has that cellular appearance to it that you often see in water foam. And you can also update the frequency characteristics like the lacunarity, the persistence, and how sharp or soft these features are. So finally, let's take a look at the shoreline foam. So let's jump over to the shore here. So I can control where this foam appears. Now this is calculated based off the depth of the water at any one point. So I can increase how far this kind of carries out into the water. I can increase the intensity, the scale of that pattern. Let's see, let's pull it in a little bit here. So I think that looks a bit better. and then the speed of the pattern, the offset. So lots of different parameters you can tune here for the shoreline foam. Now, if you want to get into some more performance stuff, that's where you might be looking at the geometry. So let's set this to low quality for now. Then I'm going to go in the debug menu and turn on wireframe. Then I'm also going to turn the ocean floor off. So what we see here is that very close to the camera, we have a really fine mesh. So we're getting a lot more of that wave detail when the water is close to the camera. Then as it goes further away, we're reducing that level of detail. So we're trying to kind of optimize it in a way and make it more efficient. We're not simulating a really fine detailed mesh really far away from the camera where we're not going to see that detail anyway. So we can control all of that through the geometry settings here. So right now I have the mesh resolution set to 32 by 32, and that's for the closest level to the camera. So if I set this to 64, you can see it gets finer detail there in the grid, and 128 is even finer, but we start to chug quite a bit there, primarily due to being in wireframe mode here. So I can go in here, I can change the number of LOD levels, level of detail. So if you want to maybe optimize this for really poor performance devices, you can set the level of detail levels to 2, and then you can come in here and you can pull that fog in. So you're hiding that edge of the water. But obviously you're not going to see a whole lot when the fog is this close. But there could be situations where this is what you want to do. And you can also control the size of these levels. Expand that out. Some of these UI controls, a few bugs I got to work out here. But I can control the base size of that initial LOD level. So I can increase that from 400 up to 1,000. And then I can increase those levels. You can also see I'm filtering out some of the surface normals in the distance here. That is intentional. I'll get into that shortly. Horizon fog, that's a pretty straightforward one. So that just controls the distant fog, and that's pulling in the sky color. So the fog is going to match kind of whatever's behind in the sky. And I do have the ability to add in custom skies and things like that. We'll touch on that shortly. Let's look at reflections. So the reflections are modeled via Fresnel reflection, which is just kind of a physics term you don't really need to know. But basically at really shallow angles, if you're looking like at the water at a really shallow angle, you're going to get more of the sky reflecting off of the water. Whereas when you're moving the camera up and looking more straight down on the water, you're going to pick up more of that water color and less of the sky. It's the same kind of effect when you are traveling down a really straight road and it's a really hot day. You're getting some of that sky reflecting off of that road, and the distance looks kind of like a mirage. So that's the same principle at work here. Now you can also tune how much sky you're picking up with the power slider here. So if you want more watercolor, you can crank that way up. Or if you want all of the sky color, you can turn that down. And you can also control how strong these surface normals are for the reflection. So if I turn this down, we get much softer waves. And if I turn it up, we get much stronger waves. Now, a lot of times the detail of the wave surface gets kind of grainy in the distance. So I've added some fading in there. So I can pull this fade in just to exaggerate that. And that way you're kind of attenuating out that detail at a distance, and it doesn't get that aliasing, grainy kind of look to it. So obviously you have to tune this to the distance that you want. And you can control the fall off level here as well. We'll do seafloor a bit later. Let's stay above water for now. Let's look at subsurface scattering. So this is definitely my favorite setting because this gives the best looking water. So let's look at the Sea of Thieves water. So what subsurface scattering basically simulates is when the water kind of enters a wave, think of like a wave crest that's traveling along the water. When it's going through that, it's kind of attenuating out a lot of those wavelengths, and kind of the shorter wavelengths are getting scattered out of the water and hitting your eyes. So that's why you're seeing a lot of this kind of greenish coming through in the wave crests. And you can actually control that color to whatever you want. So you can make it, bright purple if that's what you're into. Or you want to do more of an alien, toxic green wasteland look, you can do that as well. But I like to do something a bit more realistic, kind of pretty close to that. And you can control the power of that as well. So if you want it really spread out, you can reduce that power, maybe bump down the intensity as well. So that gives a really kind of smooth, scattered look. Or maybe you want it just really concentrated in the wave peaks. So you can increase that power and then increase the intensity, and then you only get it on the very kind of crests of the waves. So I like to go with the intensity around 2, then pull the power down until you're just starting to get some of that glowing. And I like to exaggerate this one a bit because I think it may not be realistic, but it just looks a bit nicer. And that's why Sea of Thieves, I think, looks so good. While we're looking at the wave appearance folder, there's some other colors we can tune here. So we have the deep color. So this is like the deepest part of the water. So that's kind of the main color. So I can make that red or green or any color here. So let's do kind of a bluish green there. And then the watercolor also changes based on the depth. So if I set the shallow color to, say, red here, you can see it's picking up that color in the shallows. And anytime it's we're kind of looking at the object that may be submerged in the water. So I can also pull the water depth up here. So now the water plane is very close to the boat. And you can see we're picking up a lot of that shallow color. So this is really nice for maybe like a tropical setting where you have like a really shallow beach, maybe a boat rocking around in there, and you want to get some of that more greenish kind of brilliant color. And it's best to not do anything too extreme, and it starts to look unrealistic. So maybe something a bit more like that. And you can also come in here and you can change the alpha as well. So as the water gets shallower, it'll get more transparent. You can also change the global water transparency. Lots and lots of settings here. All right, so let's now look at the actual wave simulation itself. So as I said before, this is based on real scientific wave data that's been collected by oceanographers. So they were able to kind of characterize the frequency spectrum of the waves, and then we can take that and we can use a mathematical principle called the fast Fourier transform. We can use the inverse fast Fourier transform to turn that frequency data, so basically how fast are the waves moving, and we can convert that to a signal in time that we can simulate. So I know that's probably way more scientific mumbo jumbo than you wanted, but that's at a high level how this all works. So we can come in here and we can control things like wind speed, and that's going to control sort of the amplitude of the waves and which frequency components get picked up. We can change the wind direction. So I want the waves to go the other way. We can certainly do that. Choppiness is a fun one. So if we turn this way down, you get very smooth waves. And then as we turn that up, we get some more of that high frequency chop as well. And that's what pulls in some of the that wave crest as well. So if you put this too high, it looks pretty ridiculous. So I like to do something a bit lower there. And you can come in here, you can change the wave amplitude if you want to pick that up a bit more, make it look a bit more stormy and intense. And there's also a frequency slider here. So if you want to kind of smooth and stretch out all these waves, we can drop that down. And that'll slow things down a bit as well too, so it can bump up the animation speed. Or we can really increase the wave frequency. but then you start to hit some repetition issues here. So this looks best around between 0.5 and 2. Now there's also some more advanced parameters here you can tune, like the wave grouping, the wave spread. So if you don't want any correlation between the waves, you turn this way down. If you want the waves very correlated together, to create these more like long, narrow wave crests that all move together, you can crank that way up. And then the gravity parameter is a fun one. So as you reduce this down, the waves get taller and move slower. And as you increase it, the waves move faster and get more compressed. You can also come in here and change the individual frequency components. So we're simulating the ripples, the waves, and the swells. So I can, let's see here. If I increase the amplitude of the ripples, you can see some of that more high frequency noise coming through. Let's bring that back down a bit. You can also control the amplitude of the waves, which is kind of the medium frequency component. Then, of course, the swells is a very low frequency component. And you can change the frequencies of all of these. Basically tune it to however you want. I've picked some values that I thought worked pretty well here. And to get the best simulated water, I find that it helps to set the ripples to the lowest amplitude, then the waves next, and then have these swells at the highest amplitude. And that prevents a lot of that repetition patterns you might see in the water. Even though WebGPU is supported across all modern browsers right now, I do realize that not everyone is running the latest, greatest browser. So I did add in a WebGL fallback here. So that bypasses the compute shaders that the WebGPU-based simulation uses and just uses a noise-based simulation. So what you can do is go into the debug folder here. I can click Force WebGL. And now we get a noise-based wave simulation. So if we go under waves, there are some settings here for WebGL. So I can control the amplitude. And this looks best when you have pretty low amplitude and larger frequencies. Then you can kind of tweak the persistence and linearity parameters here. So I can also bump this frequency up a bit, bring the amplitude down. So obviously it's not going to look as good as the physically based wave simulation, but it's still something that you can show when the user doesn't have a modern browser. Now for the sky, there's 3 different methods that I've implemented in this library. There's the Raleigh sky, which is completely procedural, and that has all the clouds and the sun and everything integrated into it. So that's definitely going to give you the best bang for your buck. But they may be a bit too intense for what you want to do. So I've also offered a gradient sky here, just a simple gradient, no clouds, no sun. And also a cube map, so you can pull in some textures. This one still has a couple issues. You can see the fog is picking up some of the clouds in the background, so a couple tweaks I need to do with that one. But let's go back to Raleigh, since that's kind of the primary one that you'll likely be using. So first of all, we can control the sky brightness. We can control the sky color. So you have the general sky color, and then that's also kind of modulated by the sun color as well. So let's say I make this kind of blue. So it's like bluish gray. I'm somewhere in kind of a sunset here, so it's a bit darker. And then as we get closer to the sun, it's going to get brighter and lighter. So I can come in here and I can change the angle of the sun. And of course, all the wave lighting is going to be updated. I can change the sun elevation. So that's going to change a lot of what you see on the water. You might get some more reflection. At higher elevations, that subsurface scattering will go away because the sun isn't shining directly through that. This one might be a bit intense. So let's try and turn that down. Let's turn down the sun intensity there. I'll show you the clouds here. So I can turn those on or off. You can change the level of coverage. You can change the scale of the clouds, the shadow color. So all of that is completely changeable within here. And you can do that all in real time as well. So I think that's everything above the water. Now let's go take a look below the water. I'm going to go to the tranquil preset. So we have our sun in the distance over here to, let's call it the west. So let me dip down below the surface here. And there's a couple things to note here. So first of all, of course, we have our ocean floor. And let's open the seafloor parameters. So you can turn this on or off. You can control the depth. And you can also come in here and control the resolution of that mesh. So this is procedurally generated. So I can control kind of the scale and height of the variation in the ocean floor here, just to make it a bit more interesting. Now, in addition to the ocean floor geometry, the texture can also be either procedurally generated, or you can pull in your own textures if you want something a bit less computationally intense. So I do have some textures preloaded here. So you can see we've now switched over to those. It has a normal map associated with it, so you pick up some of the lighting there. But if we go back to the procedural texture, you can go in here. You can turn the ripples on or off. You can change the direction of those, the scale of the ripples, colors, how strong the normals are, all that stuff. And you can also control the caustics on the ocean floor. So this is when the light comes in through the wave water surface and sort of constructively and deconstructively interferes on the bottom of the ocean. So if I turn that off, you can see now what that looks like. Not terribly exciting. But if I go in here, I can turn the intensity down, you can increase the speed of those patterns, and you can come in here and change the kind of size of those patterns, the amplitude of them, offsets. So I like to just come in here and just sort of tweak and tune things until I see something that just looks kind of right. Also helps to pull up a reference video of maybe like looking underneath the swimming pool or something. And you can try and model the acoustics to look like whatever you're trying to go for. So that's the ocean floor. Now the underwater shading is kind of my favorite part here. Let me put this on ultra mode just so make sure everything is looking great. And let's move the sun up here. Now I'm going to go into the underwater tab, and there's a couple different things here. First off, we have the fog. And it looks like my sliders might not be working here. Let me try and refresh. So there we go. We can control the transition of the fog. So it starts off picking up more of that shallower color because we're, the water closest to us isn't quite as deep. And then we can also change the density of the fog to control how murky it is. I also have a screen space distortion shader here. So we can control, how wobbly everything is, how fast you want that to be. That gives you kind of the feeling of like bobbling around in the water, things moving around. And the funnest part to play with is the surface dynamics here. So let me bring my sun back up a little bit. Right there. So if I go under the surface folder here, I can change how much that surface is absorbing. So if I want a really clear surface later, I can crank that way down, or I can increase that, and that'll completely obscure anything above the water. You can also change the index of refraction. So if you want to see everything really clearly, basically this means there's no change in density between the air and the water. So the light's going to come straight at you. Or you can increase that, and then you start to get more of that total internal reflection where the underwater surface is reflecting the light waves coming up from underneath. So it's picking up the fog instead of the light coming through the water. So I like to turn that down pretty low because it's just nice to see what's above the water. And then you can change, if I don't want any of that wobbliness, I can turn that down, or I can crank it way up, get more of that stronger refraction. Also change the reflection strength. That controls the total internal reflection, and then the normal strength as well. So lots of fun parameters to kind of play around with to get the effect you're going for. Now there are a few extra settings here that are sort of external to the wave system, the water system. I do have an audio manager set up, so it'll sort of play different tracks depending on the wind speed. I don't have that turned on right now because that can get a bit distracting with me talking over that. There's also some debug parameters here, so if you want to go in, let me pick a preset here that isn't so bright. So if I want to go in here and look at just the Fresnel component, or the reflection component only, or the watercolor, or the water depth, you can kind of debug all those different things. We have our forced WebGL checkbox here and our wireframe checkbox. For performance, we have a performance monitor up here. You can see frames per second, frame time, everything like that. I also have dynamic resolution you can enable. So if you want to target, say, 120 frames per second, that'll reduce the pixel ratio down. So this goes down to, so this will go down to 0.5. So that makes it a bit more blurry, but that's another tool you can use to get this to run really well on mobile devices. And then, of course, we have let me turn that off quick. Then we also have our post-processing. So if I turn this off, we don't get any bloom, no film grain or anything. So just by default here, I've added in some vignette. Just makes it a bit more moody. Some film grain, which always kind of helps reduce the digital feeling of this, gives it a bit more analog feeling. So you can crank that up a bit more. And then, of course, our lovely bloom settings, which make a ocean simulation what it is. And finally, if you're integrating this into your gamer app, of course, you're going to be tweaking and tuning this. So I've added a button here to print your settings to the console. So if I open up the dev console here, and we go look at the console, you can just hit this button, and then whatever you have configured here, it'll print all of those settings out. So you can go in and create an object from this and just pass it in when you're initializing the water, and it'll use this as a new preset. So really straightforward way of creating your own presets and getting them loaded in correctly. So that is coverage of the whole demo app and all the different features. The code is available for purchase on my website, Three.jsroadmap.com. And I'll briefly get into kind of the organization of the code, just so you know what you're getting. So of course you get this demo app, which allows you to test everything out. But really the star of the show is the library, the Three.js Water Pro library, which is what you're going to be integrating into whatever you're building. Obviously, you're not going to be packaging this demo app with whatever you're shipping. That'd be way too heavyweight. So you get those two different things, and I've written up documentation for both of those. So let's jump over to the documentation page quick. So this is actually public. You can go and look at these docs right now without even purchasing, and I'll add a link to that in the description or the comments. But you can come in here, and I have a guide on how to install this. So how to build out the ESM module, if you want to add it in that way, or if you want to copy the source code directly, aliasing and Vite, just some requirements, some good to know things here. And then I also have a basic example I've provided for both if you're using TypeScript and a bundler like Vite, or if you want to just go the plain old vanilla JavaScript route and get Three.js via CDN, you can do that as well. But at the end of this example, you'll have a very basic demo running with some objects floating around on the water surface, having a preset loaded in. And that'll get you up and running pretty quickly. Also discussing different presets here, different quality levels, how to use the buoyancy system, There's also some water masking. So if you're adding in something that is concave, like a boat hull, you may have water clipping through that. So there's a way of defining a mask to basically occlude the water that would otherwise be showing through that boat and making it look like it was about to sink. So that's a really handy system there. Additionally, I wanted the Sky system to be really extensible, so I've created a Sky provider interface. And then you can come in here, either use one of the types I provided. So I have Raleigh Sky, Gradient Sky, or the Cube Map. I kind of run through how to implement all of those. Or if you want to implement your own Sky completely, here's the interface that you would use. And some stuff on the underwater effects, how to detect when the camera goes underwater. So I'll try and keep adding on to these how-to sections here as more questions come up. In addition to the how-to guide, of course, we have all the API documentation. So this goes through all the different objects. The primary one here is the water system. So I've detailed out all the different parameters and options. And yeah, there's a lot here to go through, but hopefully any questions that you have can be answered by coming into these docs. Finally, we have the change log. You can see everything that's changed. I've just released this newest version here, which adds in the ESM module build option, as well as a couple new presets. And as far as licensing goes, this is a license for personal or commercial use. So obviously you can't resell this or anything, but you're free to include this in any of your projects. All right, my friends, that is a run through of Three.js Water Pro. This has been a labor of love for the last month or so, so I'm really excited to share it with all of you and see what you guys are going to build with this. So be sure to go on 3jsroadmap.com and check this out. I'll add a link for that in the description. And if you buy this, you also get access to the Discord, so you can come and ask me any questions at all if you need to. So yeah, I hope